I understand my primary responsibility as a leader is to remove obstacles for my team in order for them to be as effective and as successful as they can be. I really subscribe to the idea of my team members and the associates at the company being humans first and workers second. So I try to see kind of the human element in everything we do. And if you think back at that period, that was a really challenging period, not just from a professional standpoint, but from a personal standpoint, right? A couple of days after that, I got a call from the CEO of the company, and he said, and at the time that was a different CEO from today, and he said he wants to partner with me to deal with this crisis. And I think this became a particularly kind of memorable time for me for two reasons. One is that's when I understood that you don't need to have a big title to contribute. You can always contribute regardless of your position. So we can't just wait until these crises happen, but we almost need to anticipate them. And that as a result, we established a formal supply chain risk management function.
WILLspiration, a podcast series where willpower meets inspiration. Today, our guest is Gabriella Wortmann, Vice President of Global Planning and Operations at New Balance. She stepped into this role just before COVID turned global supply chains upside down, turning her job into a real-time stress test of leadership. We'll talk about decision-making under extreme uncertainty, what really happens when global systems are hit by a crisis, and what leaders can learn from operating under constant pressure. WILLspiration is a podcast by the Women in Leadership League Foundation, where we bring leadership stories close to you. Gabriella, thank you for accepting our invitation. We are very glad you are here. Let's start by zooming out for a moment. If you had to explain global supply chain in 60 seconds, what would you say, and what is the biggest misconception people have about it?
First of all, thank you for having me. In layman terms, I would say that my team predicts how many pairs of shoes and how many pieces of apparel will be needed in the marketplace. We facilitate manufacturing and ensure that all these products get to the customers on time, with the right quality, and with the lowest cost possible. I would say that's a good summary of what supply chain does in general. And I would say the biggest misconception about it is that it's just logistics. And it's understandable because supply chain is a fairly new discipline. So a lot of people think that it just encompasses logistics, while actually it's a very complex, very multifaceted area. It includes, for example, my team includes demand planning, supply planning, inventory planning, order management, product compliance, integrated business planning, supply chain risk management. So as I said, it's actually a very complicated, very broad range of disciplines.
It does indeed sound complex and very exciting as well. Looking back at your path, what was the moment when you realized this is my field?
As you know, I was born in Hungary and I studied liberal arts, first in Hungary, then in China and Taiwan. And then I moved to the US to complete my MBA. And as I was going through my studies there, I realized that I'm not really interested in the traditional fields that most MBA students are interested in, like corporate finance or accounting or marketing. I was more drawn to two courses. One was operations management, the other one was supply chain management. And I was so interested in those fields that I actually volunteered for the professors. I became a teaching assistant. I actually, even after graduation, I kept going back to be a guest lecturer in those classes. So that's when I realized that those are kind of the fields I'm really interested in. And after graduation, when I joined Deloitte Consulting, I actually worked mostly on operations management projects. So I didn't try to get involved with strategy or system implementation. I really wanted to do operations project.
It sounds exciting that you actually stepped out from behind your desk and you started to touch everything and build with your own hands. It sounds like a risky area. So before COVID, what were the top 2-3 risks you were already planning for? And what did a very bad week look like at those times?
Well, you're right. COVID kind of put everything into perspective, right? But even before that, we had our fair share of crises at New Balance. When I started working in the department that I'm leading now, of course, it looked very different at the time. It was much smaller. I would say we had 3 really big challenges. One was that our manufacturing was very much concentrated in China. So obviously that carries a lot of risk if your manufacturing is focused in one country. The other challenge was that we weren't a very good customer to our suppliers. So we had few suppliers, not as many as we have today, and we just weren't a very attractive customer to them. So some of them were really hesitant to do business with us, and some of them even kind of exited the business at the time.
What was the reason for that?
And that's the third area. Our supply chain processes and policies were either very immature or even non-existent. So, for example, we didn't have effective demand planning, so we couldn't enable our downstream planning to our supply partners. So we weren't able to give our supply partners projections 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, what we are going to produce. And that uncertainty or lack of visibility really impacted them. They couldn't plan themselves, so they obviously wanted to work with a partner that gave them projections. So that was just one example where our supply chain processes were very immature.
Getting back to the bad week, do you remember which the bad week was before COVID?
Yes. For example, once when we had one of our major suppliers telling us that they don't want to do business with us anymore because we weren't able to work with them effectively, essentially. So it wasn't about money or the prices we were paying. It wasn't about values. Obviously, New Balance has always been an incredible company. It was more about our processes, our supply chain processes. So that was a very tough week for us.
I can imagine that. And do you remember the first signal of the COVID crisis? The moment that made you think, wow, this is something different. We are entering a different world.
I do, but it's not supply chain related. I remember clearly that there was a Thursday in March 2020 when we got an email from our HR department telling us that the next day on Friday, we're going to do kind of a rehearsal of working from home. They said, well, we know that there is a virus out there and we know that it's going to have a huge impact. So let's practice how to work from home. So everybody stay at home, use Skype. At the time we used Skype for our meetings, and let's see whether the organization is ready for that. And we did that on a Friday, and that weekend the country shut down and we never went back to the office, not until 2.5 years later. So I think that pretty much stands out in my memory as
yes. We had a school lockdown, which was announced on March 13th. And I still remember that moment when it was announced and how we also never got back to the office for quite a long time. I can relate to that. And take us into the early weeks of the crisis. What changed first? I guess what you have just told us. What changed second? And when did it become clear that, okay, this is not just a 2-week-long disruption, but this is going to be a long haul?
Even before that weekend in March, actually, if you recall, COVID started in China in late 2019, so in November, December, I think. So we actually had a crisis to deal with starting November, December 2019, because we still had production in China and we had a subsidiary, a sales office in China. So we couldn't get products out of China, and we couldn't supply. We couldn't service our subsidiary in China because the border is closed. So we kind of, at the time, we had the feeling that this is going to be something big. We just didn't know how big. But it almost like, as we were managing the crisis in China, we understood that at some point this is going to impact the US in a big way as well. We just didn't know how big and how long it's going to last. So, and then that weekend that I mentioned in March, suddenly all our stores closed. All our retail partners' stores closed. A large percentage of the orders that our retail partners had with New Balance got canceled. So demand pretty much disappeared overnight. And that's when the company understood that we probably have to start shifting to a more what we call DTC, direct-to-consumer model, so e-commerce in short. And at the time, our DTC business, it was obviously, we had it, but it wasn't a very sophisticated business. And we understood that it's not just a business model that has to move towards a direct-to-consumer model, but it's our operating model as well. So that impacted the supply chain. And then as we were pivoting towards a more e-commerce type of model in those first few weeks and months after the pandemic essentially started, demand came back in a really big way. So New Balance did an incredible job of kind of shifting to DTC and kind of taking advantage of the fact that during the pandemic, a lot of people still want to go outside. They still want to run. They still want to exercise. They're focusing on their health. And that obviously benefited our business. And we did an incredible job of kind of taking advantage of that.
I would say maybe even more people wanted to. I never ran so regularly as back in the COVID days. Everything was empty and wearing a mask, which was quite uncomfortable, but you could still go out for a run every morning. So instead of taking the kids to school, I actually went for a run and then I started to work at home.
Exactly. So, and I think a lot of people did that at the time. And as demand came back, unfortunately, that's when supply disappeared a little bit, or it got severely impacted. A big portion of our production at the time was in Vietnam. So we were definitely more diversified than before. I mentioned that 15, 20 years ago, we were mostly producing our products in China. When COVID started, we were much more diversified. We had production in China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and a bunch of other countries. But Vietnam was one of our major sources of supply. And then suddenly, when our demand was so strong, Vietnam closed. And we weren't able to get any supply out. And it really happened overnight. And I think that's when we understood that even though our supply chain is already fairly diversified, we need to diversify it even more. And we need to be much more intentional and proactive about managing and mitigating supply chain risks. So we can't just wait until these crises happen, but we almost need to anticipate them. And that as a result, we established a formal supply chain risk management function that kind of balances resilience with responsiveness. And it monitors both internal and external risks to the supply chain. It measures risk levels. And that function also creates its own playbook, what to do once something happens. So that was fairly advanced for our industry. I'm not aware of any other any of our competitors having a formal supply chain risk management function.
Wow. And if we look back to those 2.5 years that we are just discussing, does anything stand out as being like the toughest part?
Definitely. I mean, honestly, it all felt like an endless crisis, but one thing after the other. But really what takes the number one spot is what I just mentioned, is the production shutdown in Vietnam. And that's because, as I said, Vietnam has been one of our major sources. So a significant portion of our production is in Vietnam. And just the whole uncertainty around it, it shut down one day and we absolutely had no idea when it's going to reopen. We didn't have any influence over the situation. All we could do really is move production from Vietnam to other countries. But obviously, when you're moving production to other countries, those factories have to redevelop the product, recommercialize the product. That obviously adds to the whole go-to-market timeline. That means delay to the customer. So we impacted our customers in a major way. And honestly, we did not know when the country would reopen again. And it took 3 months.
And you mentioned that previously it was a disadvantage that you couldn't plan ahead. So I can imagine that in this time it was also very hard to plan ahead.
Exactly. There was no way to plan ahead because we didn't know when those factories would open.
Yeah. But at least you weren't alone with that by that
That's
time.
True. That's true.
It was true for everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah. When supply is constrained, someone always loses. What were the hardest trade-offs that you had to make in the period that we are discussing? How did you decide what a fair decision would be at that time?
That's a really good question because I felt that during that time there were trade-offs all around. And at some point, all our suppliers, all our customers, all our third-party supply chain partners, everybody got impacted somehow. But one important learning for us at the time was how to operate in a supply-constrained environment. Starting the fall of 2020, we found ourselves in a supply-driven planning environment, which what that means is that we had to base our plans, our company plans, on available capacity at our suppliers, on available raw materials. And that coupled with, if you remember, there were extremely long logistics lead times at the time. So all that kind of created this very constrained environment. So what we did as a supply chain is we developed our own allocation model to ensure that we distribute that very finite and limited supply in an equitable manner to our customers. We said, this customer, this is how much you get. This other customer, this is how much you get. So we essentially, it wasn't based on what they need or what their demand is. It was based on what we can supply. And we said, this is your share, this is your share. So we had to do that. It was a very tough decision because no customer was happy about that. But it was something that honestly we had to do. And this was definitely a paradigm shift for us because we were always a very customer-focused, very demand-driven business.
How long did that specific model last?
Even after our supply constraints went away, so let's say Vietnam reopened and we had enough supply, the company liked the allocation model so much that they said it actually provides a level of predictability to our customers. So we actually kept it for a while. We have it even today, but obviously it serves a different purpose because our supply is not severely constrained anymore. But it actually, we kept the allocation model going for a really long time, for years.
I see. And during the most intense periods, how did you keep your teams functioning, not just operationally, but emotionally? What did people need most from you as a leader?
So my leadership style has really 3 tenets. And during that time, I just try to lean into those even more. The first one I would say is multiculturalism. And the reason for that is because I have teams all around the world, not just in the US. I have a team in China. I have another team in Hong Kong, a team in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Japan, in the UK, so all around the world. So I think you have to kind of maintain a culturally inclusive environment. And it's not just respect for various cultures, but it's also respect for different ways of working. And that has always been very important to me. The other one, the second one, I would say is what people call servant leadership, which is I understand my primary responsibility as a leader is to remove obstacles for my team in order for them to be as effective and as successful as they can be. And the third one is I really subscribe to the idea of my team members and the associates at the company being humans first and workers second. Mm-hmm. So I try to see kind of the human element in everything we do. And if you think back at that period, that was a really challenging period, not just from a professional standpoint, but from a personal standpoint, right? People had to deal with a lot of uncertainty in their personal lives. They had to deal with illness or death or changing circumstances. So I wanted to make sure that if anybody in my team needs the time, the space, or the support to deal with any of this, it will be granted. I wanted to make sure they understand that they don't have to worry about me not understanding or not accommodating their personal circumstances.
I can very much relate to that. At that time, I was also responsible for quite a lot of people. And one of them was actually very much afraid of the COVID epidemic. I don't know why, but she was like scared of it. And she formally asked me to be able to stay away from the office, which we didn't usually allow, like for many months. But I did allow this to her. And she was actually infected by COVID and she died of COVID. And while all being out of the office. So you really have to look out for your people, because if I didn't let her stay out of the office, I would never have forgiven to myself that this is on me, that her death is on me. So this is really important, I think, that you always put your people first. And you must be responsible for quite a lot of people. How many people do you oversee in total, employees?
Overall, I think I have around 120 people.
With how many of them do you interact directly?
So my direct report, I have 9 direct reports.
But I guess you would talk to more than 9 people.
Of course. I talk to everyone in my team. Yes.
Wow, that must be a lot. So you have to be really careful with your own resources, right? How did you look out for yourself at that time? Like being there for everyone as a serving leader, taking them into account, always putting them first, and then, not losing yourself in that process.
I think 2 things. One is when I recognized signs of burnout or signs of fatigue on myself, I knew that I have to take a break, because if I burnt out or exhausted or not in a good place mentally, then I have nothing to give, right? So I always try to kind of listen to the signs that my body has been giving me. The other thing is kind of similar to what you did, is I exercised a lot. I thought that exercise was a really great help, not just in the physical sense, but in the mental sense as well.
Yeah, I can totally underline that, yes. What were the most important changes that you implemented because of COVID? And were there things that you deliberately did not change? Although there was a temptation to do that.
We made a couple of lasting changes. I think the first one I mentioned, that we established a formal supply chain risk management function. And we decided to be much more proactive about managing and mitigating supply chain risks. Another one that we realized during COVID is that what we call orchestration functions are very important. And when I say orchestrations, it means these functions provide process linkages and decision-making forums, so you can align trade-offs between different functions. For example, we realized that we need more orchestration between demand planning and supply planning, or supply chain management and finance, or supply chain management and the commercial side of the company. So these, what we call orchestration functions, became much more important, and we established a formal integrated business planning function. And that's what they do. They essentially just integrate these various functions to make sure that we're all working towards one goal. So that was a big change for us. The other one was more a company-wide change. So it wasn't just a supply chain, it was a company-wide change. And in those early days of COVID, we realized that in order to eliminate red tape, we as a company, we will organize ourselves we will organize our work, our most critical work, into strategic pods. So we had around 4 or 5 strategic pods going on at the same time. And what that meant is, let's say I mentioned the shift to DTC. That became a pod. Or dealing with production shutdowns. That was another pod. So these pods, this alignment on singular priorities greatly improved not just associate engagement during that time, but decision-making speed, decision-making quality, and the leadership of the company was very much involved. And I think we have had many accomplishments that otherwise would not have been achieved without the focus and the support of company leadership. And then you asked, what is it that we did not change? And honestly, I couldn't think of anything. I think we still have these strategic pods going, which I mentioned. I feel like these make us so much more effective. And honestly, like our whole business model and operating model changed as a result of COVID.
We have talked before, and then you mentioned to me how interesting the company structure at New Balance is. And now that you mentioned leadership, it came to my mind how they handle this situation. I guess they would have been quite hands-on. So what did you get from your own superiors in return for you being a serving leader?
The same. Honestly, I report to the CEO of the company, the chief operating officer, and he absolutely behaves the same way as a leader as I do. He's a true servant leader. He's always available if we need him. And during that time, as I mentioned these strategic pods. And what that meant is that essentially you kind of did the work, but then you had almost a daily check-in with both the CEO and the CEO of the company. They wanted to make sure that they give you all the support you need. And almost like that opened up communications channels even more between members of the senior leadership team.
So this is really in your company culture as well.
Yes.
That's very nice. Since 2022, have you faced crises that were faster or deeper than COVID in your specific area? And how would you now triage in the first 24 hours?
Nothing like COVID, obviously. But we definitely have had kind of supply chain issues since then. Shipping route disruptions, either due to war or terrorism. We had obviously the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel. We had natural disasters in Asia. So all these obviously created supply chain crises that we had to solve for. And what I always urge my team to do when something like this happens, no matter how small or how big, is first, the very first step is to understand the facts and the data. How many orders are affected? How many suppliers? How many customers? So really just understanding the data behind the situation, even before you respond, even before you communicate anything out, even before you do any further assessment of the situation, understand the data itself.
Mm-hmm. I would assume that the COVID crisis actually helped you to build that kind of deep thinking about a new crisis. So I would assume that it really helped you to be better able to understand what's going on now.
Definitely. Definitely.
Okay. AI is transforming how supply chains are planned and managed. From your perspective, where does AI genuinely add value today, and where do leaders need to be cautious?
Again, a really good question, something that we think about almost every day now. And to be honest, even in the supply chain, there is a lot of hype about AI. Honestly, I get an email or a phone call almost every day from an AI company telling me how they are going to solve all my problems in the supply chain. And I think as a leader, you have to be able to differentiate and separate the hype from where it's really going to add value. And I think in order to be able to do that, in order to be able to have that judgment, I think the first and most important thing you have to do as a leader and as a supply chain team is to educate yourself. So what we are doing now is we're actually selected a couple of people in the team that will undergo formal AI training. And they're not going to become programmers. We're not programmers. We are supply chain people, but they can learn a lot about the technology side. They already know the business side. So they're going to turn into what we call translators, which means they're going to sit between the business and technology, and they're going to be able to help us pinpoint very specific use cases for AI. Where is it truly where AI will be able to add value to us? So that's the first thing we are doing is everybody in my team, we have to educate ourselves. The second thing we are doing is what I call planful experimentation. So experiments can be costly and sometimes they can fail, but I try to create a culture in my team where that's perfectly fine. So I encourage my team to experiment with AI. And we have one of these experiments going now where we partnered with an AI team to look at our raw material lead times and see if AI can help us predict raw material lead times better. So I think that's the other thing is the team has to be open to experimenting and they don't have they don't have to worry about failure that much because some of these experiments will definitely fail.
Yes, innovation always involves failure. And if we can embrace that, then that's when we can become really innovative.
Exactly.
Yes. Let's shift our focus to your professional experience as a whole. Is there a day that really stands out among all those years that you have worked hard? And can you tell us the story of that specific day? Like your most memorable day?
This predates COVID. This was really a long time ago. I think it was very early in my career at New Balance. At the time, I was based in China, and I think that was maybe my first or second year in the supply chain department. I was a relatively new manager, and I was in China as a development opportunity. I was just there for a year to learn about manufacturing and materials management. But one day, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, we encountered a situation where one of our biggest suppliers came to us and said that essentially they are having second thoughts about doing business with us and they want to exit the business. And that obviously would have crippled the company in a big way. And given the criticality of this issue, I assumed that it's going to be my manager or my manager's manager who is going to take charge. But then a couple of days after that, I got a call from the CEO of the company, and he said, and at the time that was a different CEO from today, and he said he wants to partner with me to deal with this crisis. And I think this became a particularly kind of memorable time for me for two reasons. One is that's when I understood that you don't need to have a big title to contribute. You can always contribute regardless of your position. And the second thing I realized that I indeed have a seat at the table and my voice matters, even though, and I can participate in decision making, even though I'm new in my position. And most importantly, I'm a woman in a very, very male-dominated environment.
That could be a conversation on its own, how being a woman in a male-dominant environment can look like. Maybe we will talk about that next time. Thank you so much for being here today with us on the WILLspiration podcast. It was wonderful to talk to you and to hear your thoughts, and thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and follow WILLspiration for more leadership stories.